Jessica Chapman was born on the 1st of September, 1991, and Holly Wells was born just a few weeks later, on the 4th of October the same year. They were both 10 years old, two young girls from a quiet town in Cambridgeshire, England. The town they lived in was called Soham, peaceful, picturesque, the kind of place where neighbors know each other and children play in the streets without worry. Jessica and Holly were best friends, inseparable. They went to the same school, shared the same classroom, and lived just a few minutes apart from one another. It was the kind of friendship that forms naturally at that age, full of innocence, laughter, and shared secrets. The girls had many things in common, but one of the biggest was their love for football, specifically Manchester United Football Club. Both Jessica and Holly were proud fans of the team, and each of them had a red Manchester United shirt with the club's crest printed proudly on the chest. They wore them often, especially when they were together. And it was on a warm summer's day, Sunday, August 4th, 2002, that those shirts would become part of one of the most heartbreaking images ever shared in a missing persons case in the UK. That Sunday, Jessica and Holly were spending the day at Holly's home. Her family had invited relatives and friends over for a small barbecue in their back garden. It was a typical summer afternoon, filled with the sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and the smell of food on the grill. The girls were happy. They spent most of the day playing, chatting, and enjoying each other's company. At around 6:15 p.m., without telling anyone, Jessica and Holly decided to leave the house for a moment. Just a quick walk to the local shop, they thought, to get some sweets. It was a decision made in the moment, something so small and ordinary that no one at the barbecue even noticed they were gone at first. The shop was only a short distance away, but the girls never came back. Time passed. The barbecue slowly wound down. People started to pack up, and Holly's parents began tidying the house. It wasn't until 8:30 p.m. that they realized something didn't feel right. They hadn't seen the girls in over 2 hours. At first, it was a natural assumption. Maybe they were upstairs, maybe watching TV, or playing quietly. Holly's parents checked her bedroom, then the living room, the garden, but there was no sign of them anywhere. A sense of unease began to creep in. They searched nearby streets, the park, local hangout spots, anywhere the girls might have wandered off to. But by 9:45 p.m., they knew something was wrong. They called the police. The Cambridgeshire police responded immediately. Two 10-year-old girls, missing in a small town, was not something they could take lightly. Officers were dispatched, and by early the next morning, the story had already made its way into the national media. Jessica and Holly's faces were now on television screens, in newspapers, and on posters across the country. The photo used in nearly all coverage was one taken just hours before they disappeared, a simple snapshot from the barbecue. In it, the two girls are smiling, standing side by side, each wearing her bright red Manchester United shirt. It was a haunting image, so recent, so full of life, now associated with a mystery that was beginning to grip the entire nation. The town of Soham, where Jessica and Holly lived, was small, quiet, the kind of place where people greeted each other by name, where children played safely in front gardens, and everyone knew who everyone was. It was more than just a town. It was a close-knit community. So when news broke that two 10-year-old girls had vanished without a trace, the reaction was instant. People rallied. Hundreds of volunteers showed up, friends, neighbors, even strangers, ready to help in any way they could. It wasn't just a police investigation anymore. It had become a town-wide mission. Parents, teenagers, shopkeepers, they all joined the search. They walked through fields, scanned the woods, knocked on doors, and handed out leaflets. For many of them, this wasn't just news. These were children they had seen grow up, or whose parents they knew personally. 3 separate police units were deployed to support the search. Even in the earliest hours, the investigation had already become one of the largest missing persons cases in recent memory. And within the first 24 hours after Jessica and Holly were last seen, the police made their first public appeal. It was broadcast on national television, with officers asking for any information, any tip, no matter how small, that might lead to the girls' safe return. The surrounding area, like many parts of Cambridgeshire, was rural. There were vast open spaces, fields, meadows, and patches of thick woodland. The initial belief was that perhaps the girls had wandered into one of these areas and gotten lost. It seemed possible, even hopeful, that they were simply waiting somewhere to be found. Investigators attempted to trace Jessica Chapman's mobile phone, hoping for a clue. But this was 2002. Mobile phone technology was still limited. All the authorities could determine was that the phone signal had last pinged in Soham itself. No further details, no specific location. The day after the girls went missing, their parents appeared on national television. With trembling voices and tear-filled eyes, they made a heartfelt plea for the safe return of their daughters. It was a moment that touched the hearts of millions. You could see the pain in their faces, the desperation, the hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would see them and come forward. To help coordinate the growing search, St. Andrew's Primary School, the school Jessica and Holly attended, was transformed into a temporary operations base. Police teams reported back there. Volunteers gathered for updates. Maps were marked, sightings logged. It became the nerve center of a rapidly expanding search effort. And soon, potential leads began to trickle in. A woman from a nearby village claimed she had seen the two girls walking past her window the following morning, still wearing their red Manchester United shirts. It seemed like an important sighting, one that sparked a flicker of hope. Another lead came from someone who reported seeing a suspicious white van about 10 miles outside Soham. Police located the vehicle and searched it thoroughly, but it led nowhere. No evidence, no trace of the girls. By August 9th, 5 days after the girls had vanished, there was still no sign of them. Desperation was growing. That day, staff at a local sports center began reviewing their CCTV footage. And finally, a break. The security cameras had captured images of the girls entering the building on the very day they disappeared. The footage confirmed their presence, but also raised new questions. Had they gone there to meet someone? Had they arranged to meet a stranger they'd encountered online? Police quickly explored the possibility that the girls had met someone through a chat room, something that was beginning to worry parents more and more in the early 2000s. But just as quickly as the theory emerged, it was dismissed. There was no digital trail, no online conversations, no evidence that anyone had lured them there. A local taxi driver in Soham came forward with what seemed like a more promising tip. He told officers that on the night the girls disappeared, he saw a green car driving erratically, struggling with two children inside. He believed the driver was having difficulty controlling them. The car, he said, had then driven into an estate in a nearby town called Newmarket. Police took this lead seriously. It was made public, broadcast on the news, shared across media outlets. That very night, the publicity triggered another call. A man walking his dog just outside Newmarket had noticed something strange. Two mounds of earth at the side of the road. They looked out of place. Freshly turned soil, small enough to raise alarm. He called the police, fearing the worst, shallow graves. Officers rushed to the scene, their hearts heavy with dread. But after careful excavation, the mounds turned out to be nothing more than badger burrows. There were no signs of Jessica or Holly anywhere nearby. Still, the search continued. As the investigation expanded, officers in a different part of the country began examining a possible link between this case and another one, an attempted child abduction from a year before. No one was ready to give up. Not the police, not the public, and certainly not the families. But day after day, the trail seemed to grow colder, and the question lingered in everyone's mind. Where were Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells? A year before Jessica and Holly disappeared, in 2001, another case had deeply unsettled parents in Cambridgeshire. A 6-year-old girl had narrowly escaped being abducted by a man in a green car. The attacker had threatened to kill her. But somehow, she managed to get away. The man was never identified. He vanished, just a shadow in a memory, and was never caught. Police believe the same man may have also been following another young girl, a 12-year-old, sometime later. Again, in a green car. But it was never confirmed if the two incidents were connected, or if it was even the same man. And now, in 2002, with Jessica and Holly missing, the fear was that this green car, this unknown man, might have returned. The community was growing more anxious. The days without answers dragged on. But something happened on August 15th, 11 days after the girls vanished. Sky News aired a special segment, one that retraced Jessica and Holly's final known steps on the day they went missing. The program was a thoughtful look back at what little was known so far, but it also brought something unexpected into the light. As part of the broadcast, they interviewed a man named Ian Huntley, the last known person to have seen the girls. Ian Huntley wasn't a stranger to the investigation. In fact, he had come forward early, very early. Almost immediately after news of the girls' disappearance broke, he approached the police himself. He told them that he'd seen Jessica and Holly that Sunday evening, around 6:15 p.m., as they were leaving the shop where they'd gone to buy sweets. At the time, Huntley was working as a school caretaker at a local secondary school. Not the one Jessica and Holly attended, but a nearby one. He lived just a few steps away from the shop the girls had visited, in a house with his girlfriend, Maxine Carr. And Maxine was more than just Ian's partner. She was a teaching assistant at St. Andrew's Primary School, Jessica and Holly's school. She was, in fact, their classroom assistant. Someone they knew, someone they trusted. That made Huntley's statement even more significant. If he had indeed seen them that evening, it would make him the last confirmed witness to their whereabouts. Shortly after Ian Huntley's interview, Maxine Carr gave one of her own. She spoke kindly of the girls, how sweet they were, how much she enjoyed teaching them, how the class had been devastated by their disappearance. Her words were soft, but something in her demeanor didn't sit right with everyone. When the interview ended and the news crew began packing up, one member of the production team mentioned something that seemed odd, something off in the way Maxine had spoken, something that made it feel not entirely genuine. Police, already grasping at any thread, began to grow suspicious. They took a closer look at Maxine and at Ian, and suddenly, the pieces began to shift. Huntley's behavior had raised quiet concerns for days. He seemed deeply invested in the case, unusually invested, especially for someone who barely knew the girls. He had only ever spoken to them once, and yet, he had positioned himself at the center of the investigation. He was always around, always nearby, always willing to talk to reporters, always asking questions, always offering help. Some officers noticed his eagerness. He wasn't just cooperative, he was enthusiastic. Too enthusiastic. Meanwhile, Maxine's tone in her interview didn't seem like someone simply grieving the loss of her students. There was something practiced about it, as though she wasn't just remembering the girls, but reciting something rehearsed. At first, it was just a feeling, a shadow. But now, investigators were starting to wonder, did Maxine know more than she was letting on? And why was Ian Huntley, a man with no real connection to the girls, always one step behind the headlines, always one step ahead of the investigation? The atmosphere around the case was changing. The search for the girls was no longer just about where they had gone. Now, it was becoming a question of who was truly behind their disappearance, and whether the answer had been closer than anyone dared to imagine. If everything so far hadn't raised red flags already, the fact remained: Ian Huntley was the last known person to have seen Jessica and Holly alive. And that alone was chilling. On August 16th, 12 days after the girls were reported missing, Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr were taken into custody for questioning. Quietly, separately. No major announcements. No dramatic arrest. Just two people brought into two different police stations. Their statements were simple. They said they had been home together that night. Just the two of them. A quiet evening. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, and somehow that was enough. After 7 hours of questioning, they were released. The public didn't know what had happened behind those closed doors, but one person who had been following the case very closely did. A Sky News reporter who had been covering the story from the beginning learned about the couple being brought in, and once they were released, he called Maxine Carr, asking for an update. She answered, calmly. She didn't sound worried. In fact, she seemed almost unaffected, but the reporter wasn't convinced. Before we go further into what happened next, there's something important we need to do. Understand who Ian Huntley really was. Because what's about to unfold can't be fully understood without knowing the man at the center of it all. Ian Huntley was born in Grimsby, England in 1974, a town just a few hours north of Soham. He was 28 years old when Jessica and Holly disappeared. His childhood was difficult. He was relentlessly bullied throughout school. He never had many friends, never really fit in, always on the outside looking in. In December 1994, he met an 18-year-old girl named Claire Evans. They fell into what some described as a whirlwind romance, married just 2 weeks after they met. But the relationship didn't last. Claire fell out of love with Ian, and worse, she began a relationship with his younger brother, Wayne. Ian was devastated, not because he still loved Claire, but because he couldn't stand the idea of her being with someone else, especially his own brother. He refused to let her go. Ian kept Claire tied to him in name, refusing a divorce for 5 years, until 1999, just to prevent her from moving on. It wasn't about love. It was about control. And Claire was only the beginning. In 1998, while still legally married to Claire, Ian started a relationship with a 15-year-old girl named Katie. He got her pregnant. That part of his past would come back again later, when people began asking questions. But it wasn't just messy relationships and broken promises that marked Ian Huntley's past. In that same year, at 25 years old, Ian was charged with burglary and the rape of an 18-year-old woman. It shattered what was left of his already fragile reputation in the Lincolnshire area. And it wasn't the only allegation. Not by far. Over the years, there had been multiple accusations of sexual assault. Some involved teenage girls, one involving a child as young as 11 years old, an assault Huntley would later admit to. Only one charge had ever been officially filed, but the allegations were numerous, and some never made it beyond whispered warnings. Some were never reported. Some never reached courtrooms or headlines, but they existed. They followed him, quietly, like shadows. All of this, the assault allegations, the controlling behavior, the relationships with underage girls, painted a dark, unsettling picture. A man with a history, a pattern, a past filled with danger signs. Signs that, somehow, had gone ignored for too long. And now, with 2 young girls missing and the last man to have seen them surrounded by suspicion, those signs were being brought into focus. The question remained, how had someone like Ian Huntley been allowed so close to children? And more urgently, was the truth about Jessica and Holly now tied to a past that no one had taken seriously enough? By 1999, Ian Huntley was still trying to outrun his past. But instead of changing who he was, he just changed where he was. That year, he met 22-year-old Maxine Carr. She was young, quiet, and looking for something stable. Within just 4 weeks of knowing each other, she moved in with him. To outsiders, it looked like a relationship built on connection. But inside, something darker was already taking hold. The two of them eventually moved together to Scunthorpe. It was more than a new home. It was, many believed, a way for Ian to leave behind the growing whispers, the reputation he had built as a sexual predator in his previous town. But his past followed him, and before long, the signs began to show again. A neighbor named Marissa, who lived nearby, noticed things. Quiet things, subtle but troubling. She realized the couple rarely left the house. Almost never, in fact. And more than that, she noticed something in Ian's behavior. Controlling, possessive, cold. The same pattern repeating. What began as controlling words slowly escalated into something more dangerous, violence. Not in public, not loud, but behind closed doors where no one could see. Maxine stayed, and no one really knew why. Whether it was fear or manipulation or was something harder to explain. But even as the red flags grew, the two of them moved again. In 2001, they settled in a small town called Soham, a quiet place, peaceful, unknown, until everything changed. In Soham, Maxine Carr began working at a local primary school. It was a place filled with life, with children, with trust. It was also the school where Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells were students. Maxine became their teacher. And Ian Huntley? He found work as well, as a school caretaker at a nearby college. A job that gave him access to buildings, children, and trust he never should have been given. The past that Ian Huntley had spent years trying to bury was now dangerously close to something innocent. He was no longer just a man with a history. He was in a town that didn't know him, with a partner working directly with the children whose names the world would soon come to know. Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells. The story was still unfolding, and darkness was closing in. As we return to the timeline, Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr had been questioned and released. It had been 7 hours of interrogation, and while there wasn't enough to charge them just yet, something in Huntley's answers didn't sit right. He was calm, too calm. There was something about the way he spoke, something about the way he relieved that day, that prompted investigators to take another look. Not just at his words, but at his world. So on August 17th, Nearly 2 weeks after the girls vanished, the police launched a full-scale search of both Ian Huntley's home and his workplace. And that's when everything started to unravel. At the school where Ian worked as a caretaker, police began combing through every corner. They checked utility rooms, sheds, the grounds, and eventually the bins. And inside one of those bins, they made a horrifying discovery. There, buried beneath layers of trash and ash, were the burnt remains of children's clothing. 2 football shirts, tracksuit bottoms, shoes, and underwear, all easily identified as belonging to Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. The investigation had officially shifted from a missing persons case to a murder inquiry. But finding the clothing wasn't enough on its own. Police needed to connect Ian Huntley directly to the items. After all, it was his workplace, a public building. It didn't necessarily mean he had done it. They needed something more. And then they found it. The clothing wasn't just burned. It had been carefully concealed. Someone had gone through the trouble of destroying them. And someone who worked in that building, Ian Huntley, had access, motive, and a rapidly unraveling alibi. It was enough to act. That day, police arrested Ian Huntley in Maxine's car on suspicion of murder. Tone slows, soft piano under voice in her second round of questioning. Maxine's car broke. She admitted that she had lied during her first interview. She had told police that she was home with Ian on the night of the girl's disappearance, that they had spent a normal evening together. But that was not true. She revealed she had actually been in Grimsby, 110 miles away from Soham at the time. This meant 2 things. First, her alibi for Ian had collapsed. And second, Ian Huntley now stood alone. No more cover, no more lies. He was exposed. That very same day, on August 17th, a discovery was made. More than 30 miles from Soham, in a quiet area of Suffolk countryside, a member of the public noticed something disturbing. It was a burnt patch of earth, hidden near a secluded woodland path. Buried within it were human remains. The bodies were found in such a condition that identification would not come easily. But lying beside them were a few unmistakable items. Personal objects, fragments of clothing, things that only Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman could have owned. At that moment, the world held its breath. The next day, police came forward. They addressed a nation that had spent the past 2 weeks waiting, hoping, praying. Communities had volunteered. Children had tied ribbons. Families had left candles burning in their windows. And now, the search was over. Forensic experts were called in to begin recovering the bodies, while specialist teams scoured the area for any remaining evidence. Because of the state of the remains, there would be few answers. No immediate clarity on when the girls had died or how. But there was something else. The location itself, the environment, the way the land had been disturbed, held silent clues. Police turned to an unusual group of professionals for help. Botanists, experts in plant growth, soil, natural rhythms. Because sometimes the earth can reveal what the body cannot. And in this case, nature had begun to speak. As police closed in on Ian Huntley, it wasn't just about what they found, it was about where they found it. After locating the girl's remains in a remote ditch over 30 miles away, investigators needed more. More clarity, more connection, more proof that it was Huntley who had taken them there. And then came a quiet breakthrough. While searching a narrow, overgrown pathway lined with nettles and brambles, investigators spotted something small, nearly invisible to the untrained eye. A single strand of Jessica Chapman's hair, caught delicately on a twig. It was a subtle, haunting detail, but it changed everything. Because now, police knew the exact route used to access the ditch. They could begin narrowing their focus, targeting their searches with precision. To support this next phase, they brought back the botanical experts. Because the landscape had a story to tell. Trampled vegetation, disturbed soil, the way certain plants had been crushed, bent, or broken. It all painted a picture of movement, of urgency, of secrecy. Every footprint, every path taken had left a trace in the earth. And now the evidence was stacking. The girl's clothing, found burnt and hidden in a bin at Huntley's workplace, tied him to the case already. But now, the route to the ditch, Jessica's hair caught along the way, it placed him there. Meanwhile, Investigators turned back to Huntley's home, and what they found was chilling, not in what was there, but in what wasn't. Everything was clean. Too clean. Every surface. Every room. Even the car. Police officers who had spoken with Huntley shortly after the girls vanished recalled smelling something unnatural. A strong, lemon-scented cleaning product. And the more they looked, the more they noticed. Carpets. Upholstery. The boot of his car. All meticulously scrubbed. Even the tires had been replaced. It was the kind of cleaning that didn't speak of routine, but of panic. Of someone trying desperately to erase something they could never truly erase. There's something important to understand about cleaning, especially with vacuums. Yes, they suck things up, but they also disperse particles, fibers, dust, hair. When you vacuum over an area repeatedly, you don't just clean, you redistribute microscopic fragments. And in Huntley's home, those fragments began to tell their own story. No matter how clean the house appeared, no matter how many times the floors had been scrubbed, or how strong the lemon scent lingered, something remained. And the evidence left behind, those tiny, nearly invisible remnants, were beginning to close in. By April of 2003, nearly a year after the world had watched this tragedy unfold, Ian Huntley stood in court, faced with 2 charges of murder for taking the lives of Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells. And still, he said he was not guilty. This plea meant that a full trial had to be scheduled for November. A trial where every moment, every detail would be brought back into the light. Beside him, Maxine Carr, his partner, faced charges of perverting the course of justice and assisting an offender. Her original lie, the false alibi, was just the beginning. Investigators now believed she had helped cover up the truth, possibly even playing a role in the cleanup after the girls were gone. And like Huntley, she too pleaded not guilty. For months, Ian Huntley denied everything. He maintained that he had nothing to do with the girls' deaths. Nothing to hide, nothing to fear. But just 1 month before his trial, that changed. For the first time, Huntley admitted that yes, Holly and Jessica had died inside his home. But still, he insisted this wasn't murder. He claimed it was an accident. He said the girls were walking home from the shop and Holly had a nosebleed. So, trying to help, he let them come inside to clean up. According to him, the 3 of them went into the bathroom. They were tending to Holly when he accidentally knocked her, causing her to fall into the bath and drown. He went on to say that Jessica, panicked and screaming, was so distressed that he tried to quiet her, placing his hand over her mouth. And in that moment, she stopped breathing too. This was the story Huntley told the court, but it didn't sit right, because behind the cold facts, there was something more disturbing, something darker. It later came out during the trial that just hours before the girls were seen, Huntley had been in an argument, a heated phone call with Maxine Carr, where he accused her of cheating. And it's been theorized, though never proven, that after that call, something in him snapped, that his rage, his need for control, collided with the tragic opportunity of seeing 2 young girls walking past his home. And that's when the story may have changed. That's when it became something beyond an accident. To this day, Ian Huntley maintains that it was never murder. That what happened was the result of panic, of fear, of a horrible accident gone wrong. But for the families of Holly and Jessica, for an entire community who searched and hoped, for a nation who mourned with them, there are still no answers that can undo the loss. Only the painful silence of what might never be fully known. By December of 2003, the truth, no matter how delayed, no matter how clouded, finally began to break through. In court, Maxine Carr took the stand. She admitted to lying to the police in her original interview. She had claimed that she was at home with Ian on the day the girls disappeared, that they'd spent the evening together. But that was a lie. In truth, she had been 110 miles away in Grimsby. And even though she claimed she believed Ian was innocent at the time, the damage of her false alibi had already been done. Now here's where the line between truth and manipulation becomes painfully clear. Even if Ian Huntley's version of events was somehow true, even if the deaths of Holly and Jessica were truly a tragic accident, the things he did afterwards can't be explained away. He didn't call the police. He didn't tell anyone what had happened. Instead, he burned their clothes. He hid their bodies over 30 miles away. He cleaned his house, changed his car tires, and tried to erase every trace of them from his life. These are not the actions of a man who panicked. They are the actions of someone who knew what he had done was wrong and tried desperately to bury it. And finally, on December 17, 2003, the court found Ian Huntley guilty of the murders of Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells. He was sentenced to 2 life sentences, with a minimum of 40 years before he could even be considered for release. But in truth, no one believes he'll ever walk free again. Not after this. After sentencing, another disturbing layer came to light. It was revealed that, during the trial, Huntley had tried to fake mental illness again. He would drool during interviews, speak in a confused, disjointed way, try to convince doctors and jurors alike that something was wrong with him. At one point, he was even sectioned under the Mental Health Act. But doctors found no evidence of any mental illness. None. This wasn't the first time either. Police reached out to one of his former girlfriends, and she confirmed he had used the same tactic before. Back when he faced those early sexual assault allegations, he had pretended to be mentally unwell, hoping to avoid responsibility. Both times it didn't work. As for Maxine Carr, the court found her guilty of perverting the course of justice, but not guilty of assisting an offender. The jury believed that she didn't know Ian had murdered the girls, that she had lied to protect him because she believed he was innocent, and in doing so, helped shield a monster. After her conviction, Maxine Carr was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison, but she ended up serving just 1 year and 9 months before being released. What happened next was something incredibly rare. She was given a brand new identity, not just a name change, a full identity, a completely new life. This kind of measure is extremely rare. In fact, it's only been done a handful of times in the UK. Cases like Mary Bell and Karen Matthews, the subject of another story, also involved identity protection, but not always to this extent. For Karen Matthews, for example, she was given a kind of partial identity, one that allowed her to go by a different name in public, but still had to use her legal name for official matters. But with Maxine Carr, it went even further. Because of the intensity of public hatred, and because of how closely she had been linked to Ian Huntley, authorities feared for her safety. So they gave her a completely clean slate. Some people found this hard to accept. After all, Maxine Carr didn't commit the murders, but she did lie to the police. She helped, even if unknowingly, to shield a child killer. And while she served her time, the wound she had helped deepen would never truly heal for the families or for the community. On April 3rd, 2004, the house where Holly and Jessica were killed was finally demolished. Gone. Every piece of it, disposed of in secret, scattered across undisclosed locations, so that no one could turn the place into a monument of horror, so that the site could no longer hold that dark weight. After the case closed, something else began. A deep, painful inquiry, one that asked the question no one could ignore. How did this happen? How could Ian Huntley, a man with multiple allegations of sexual assault, some of which he had admitted to, still end up working at a school? How could he have slipped through the cracks so many times? He had been accused at least 5 times before, and yet, he had only ever been charged once. The police had the information, but it wasn't shared. Background checks failed. Systems failed. And because of those failures, 2 10-year-old girls were gone. When young children go missing, one of the first steps police often take is to check for registered sex offenders living in the area. It's a tragic but necessary step, because statistically, they're often the first suspects in cases like this. So for someone like Ian Huntley, a man with multiple allegations of sexual assault, who lived just a few streets away from where Holly and Jessica disappeared, it should have triggered every red flag imaginable. But it didn't. And when investigators looked into it further, the failures became impossible to ignore. Huntley had 5 separate sexual assault allegations against him. Some he denied, what he was charged with, and another he actually admitted to, an assault involving an 11-year-old girl. But time and time again, he was allowed to walk away. Different towns, different police forces, no connection, no sharing of information. So he kept moving, and every time he moved, he got another fresh start, until finally, his past caught up to him in the most horrifying way imaginable. An investigation was also launched into how a man with that many red flags could end up working in a school, around children, the very people he should have never been allowed near. And yes, allegations are just that, allegations. But when multiple women in multiple towns all say similar things about the same man, when one of them is just 11 years old, there has to be a point where someone steps in and says, "Enough. We can't take that risk." But no one did. After Maxine Carr served just over a year and a half of her 3.5-year sentence, she was released and given lifelong anonymity. That decision, controversial from the start, came at a huge cost. Estimates range from £1 million to £50 million spent protecting her identity, because the public's anger didn't fade. In the years following her release, at least a dozen women have been attacked by strangers who believed, wrongly, that they were Maxine Carr. And perhaps the most unsettling part? Since her release, Maxine Carr has reportedly gotten married. And in 2011, she had a child. Her husband, according to sources, has no idea who she really is. No idea about her past. No idea that she once stood beside a child killer, defended him, and lied to protect him. Maybe he knows. Maybe she's told him everything in private. Maybe he's made peace with it. But maybe he doesn't know it all. And that's where it becomes hard. Not just emotionally, but ethically. Because how can you share your life with someone, build a family with someone, if they don't know who you really are? It's not about punishment. It's not about revenge. It's about the truth. And in a case filled with so much deception, so much pain, so much loss, truth is the least that's owed. To Holly, to Jessica, to their families, to everyone who loved them. Ian Huntley remains in prison to this day. But even behind bars, his life has been anything but quiet. In September of 2005, Huntley was attacked by a fellow inmate, a man named Mark Hobson, a convicted quadruple murderer. Hobson threw boiling water over Huntley, scalding him badly. The reason? He said he believed that Huntley's crimes were so disgusting, so inhuman, that even he couldn't tolerate being near him. And that says a lot, because in prison, there's a kind of unspoken hierarchy. And at the very bottom of that hierarchy, child murderers, child molesters, the ones who hurt the most vulnerable. They're the ones most despised, even by other killers. And for a man who had murdered 4 people himself to feel that Huntley had gone too far, that speaks volumes. Ironically, Huntley was actually awarded £2,500 in compensation for the attack. An internal investigation found that prison staff could have prevented it, but didn't. A year later, in September of 2006, Huntley made his second reported suicide attempt. He was found unconscious in his prison cell after taking an overdose of medication. He survived, but while he was being treated in the hospital, police searched his cell, trying to find out where he got the pills, what else he might be hiding. And what they found was unexpected. Inside his cell was a small chip, a recording device. On the chip, they found a Queen song at the start, a Meat Loaf song at the end, and, sandwiched in between them, a confession, a strange, chilling spoken message from Huntley himself, recorded privately. In it, he repeated the same story he'd told before, that Holly had a nosebleed, and that's why he let the girls into his home, that he accidentally knocked her into the bath, and she drowned. Jessica screamed, panicked, and so he put his hand over her mouth to quiet her, and accidentally suffocated her. But by this point, almost no one believed him anymore. Not the police, not the courts, not the public. Because if it was truly an accident, why didn't he call for help? Why did he try to hide their bodies? Burn their clothes? Clean his house and car so thoroughly? Why did he lie? And why did he do it all alone, in secret, for days, while the rest of the world searched for the girls? Ian Huntley's voice on that recording might have been meant to sound like a confession. But in reality, it was just another attempt to rewrite the truth, to make what he did sound less monstrous, less cruel, less deliberate. But the truth doesn't change, no matter how many songs you put around it, no matter how many times you try to reframe the story. In the recording found in his cell, Ian Huntley made a final attempt to rewrite the timeline. He claimed that he didn't dispose of the girls' bodies on Sunday night, the same night they died, as everyone had believed. Instead, he said it was Monday morning around 8:30 a.m. when he drove them out to Lakenheath. That night, he says, Holly and Jessica spent hours in the boot of his car, just outside his house. Cold, alone, hidden. He repeated his version of events. That Holly had fallen into the bath, And that's when Jessica panicked. But then the story shifted again. He said Jessica tried to use her mobile phone, maybe to call for help, maybe to call her parents. And he grabbed it, switched it off, because she kept accusing him, telling him over and over, "You pushed Holly." Ian claimed that he took Jessica downstairs, tried to explain, tried to calm her down. But when he turned his back, she ran for the door. And that's when he says he grabbed her, held her back, tried to silence her screams. And in doing so, he killed her. And Holly? She was still upstairs the entire time, still in the bath, still alive. But by the time he returned, he says it was too late. He claimed, again, that there was no sexual element to the crime. That it was never about that. That it was just a chain of accidents, a misunderstanding, a panic. But even here, in what was meant to sound like some kind of confession, it all feels too controlled, too convenient, and far too calculated. Because Ian Huntley has a long history. A history of lies, a history of abuse, a history of pushing people, especially young girls, into situations they couldn't escape from. And in the end, there's only one truth that really matters. Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, two best friends, only 10 years old, never made it home that day. That they were betrayed. That they were taken from a world that loved them deeply. And no story, no confession, no timeline change will ever make that right. In 2010, Ian Huntley was attacked again. This time, a fellow inmate slashed his throat during an altercation. The injuries weren't fatal. He was rushed to hospital, treated, and then returned to prison. The man responsible was Damian Fox, an armed robber with a long history of violence. He would later go on to kill another convicted child killer behind bars. And while none of this redeems him, it once again shows how even in the darkest corners of the prison system, Ian Huntley remained reviled, feared, despised. But there's a part of Ian Huntley's past that's often overlooked. Long before Soham, before Jessica and Holly, there was another girl. Her name was Katie. She was just 15 years old when Ian Huntley, in his early 20s, began a relationship with her. By the time Katie turned 16, she was pregnant with Ian Huntley's child. Even while she was carrying his daughter, Katie says the abuse didn't stop. He tried to push her down the stairs. He punched her, threatened her, tried to control her, but somehow she got away. She raised their daughter, Sammy, alone. Sammy grew up hearing one story, that her father was a bad man, someone who had done awful things, someone they didn't speak to for a reason, but she never knew the details. Not until one day at school, she saw a name, a face, a news story, and everything clicked. She was 11 years old when she discovered the truth. That Ian Huntley, the man responsible for the murder of two innocent girls, was her biological father. She found out by accident, and she found out alone. It's difficult to imagine what that must have felt like. To look in the mirror, to trace your roots, and see that name staring back. To carry the weight of something you never chose, something you had no control over. And yet, it's not her burden to bear, because Sammy is not defined by his crimes. She's not her father. She never was.